Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Sarah Mason, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. And I'm just going to open really quickly here with a few notes before I pass things over to our presenter. First, I do want to say that we will be recording today's session, and we'll be sending around a link of the recording to everyone who registered in case you want to revisit any of this information or if you want to pass it on to somebody else. I do also want to let you know that the presentation will end with a Q&A session. So after our presenter is done, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box that you can find in the bar at the bottom of your screen, and we can try to get to as many of those questions as possible at the end. The host organization of today's webinar is the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, which is an information and knowledge exchange hub for policy work and research on ecosystem services and nature-based solutions. If you want to find out about future webinars like this and also get a quarterly newsletter with ecosystem services and nature-based solutions updates, you can sign up for the NEST mailing list at the link that I'll drop into the chat in just a few moments. And with that, we can dive right into our presentation. So I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today. Elizabeth Losos is an executive in residence at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability here at Duke, and an adjunct professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment. She is currently working on debt for nature swaps and recently authored articles in both science and foreign policy on maximizing debt for nature swap effectiveness. She also focuses her research on how to promote sustainable and resilient infrastructure through policy research and infrastructure standards, environmental and social impacts, and enabling conditions. So welcome everyone to the webinar, and Liz, I will stop sharing and let you go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sarah. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to see all the interest in this topic. If you give me just a moment, I will share my screen and put it in. Okay, great. So thank you. I am really thrilled to be here. And I'm going to spend the next half hour or so talking about debt for nature swaps, then and now. Really going to go through four different pieces. One is the history of debt for nature swaps, how they've evolved over time, and what have been the limitations that have sort of led to the current generation of debt for nature swaps. Then we will move to really focus in more deeply on the current debt for nature swaps that you may have heard about in the news. And I'll focus in on a case study of Belize where we look at old and new swaps and compare how they're set up and what they've done. And then finally sort of bring it home with what we can learn about debt for nature swaps, but more broadly, some of the implications that are really relevant to biodiversity and climate financing more generally, because this is in many ways just a subset of what can be done more broadly in the world. So let's begin. So debt for nature swaps have actually been around for 4 decades, and they really trace their root directly back to one op-ed article that Tom Lovejoy, who was then at the World Wildlife Fund, wrote for the New York Times. And it has to be one of the most impactful, very short op-eds. And essentially what he was responding to was there was a concern in the environmental community that they were, in the early 80s, the Latin American debt crisis was building, and there was great concern that this pressure on countries, especially countries with large tropical rainforests, were being pressured to divert their limited government funding towards paying back their loans and paying back to other countries their external debt, and that this was keeping them from being able to fund their national parks, protected areas, and other natural resources and environmental topics. And not only that, but because they had to pay back these foreign loans in foreign currency, there was the sense that there was a pressure to actually increase their tropical timber trade to bring in foreign currency. So this led Dr. Lovejoy, Tom Lovejoy, to write an article with a really elegant solution. And I just quote because it's if anyone knows of Tom Lovejoy, he was quite a Renaissance man. And the way this was written was you could almost hear his voice saying it. So I'm just going to read for those of you who have the little tiny screens right now, just the last couple lines of his op-ed that said, under the best of circumstances, debtor nations find it hard to address critical conservation problems because of multiple social needs. Stimulating conservation while ameliorating debt would encourage progress on both fronts. This would be far more than a disinterested handout to mendicants. Left untouched, the environmental problems of the third world inevitably will touch our lives by generating social and political unrest. That was 40 years ago. You could see the same thing in print today. And so what this did was lead to the generation of debt for nature swaps. And the first one came about a couple years later. It was led by Conservation International in Bolivia. And essentially the way these swap works was a conservation organization or some third party would would work with creditors who own these private debt to buy back the debt on the secondary market. And the secondary market is the price of the debt that you could get on the free market. And in these countries that were under great debt distress, it was quite reduced. So in some cases like Bolivia, you might, there is an expectation of debt default, and so it might be 20 cents for every dollar of face value. So the conservation organization buys this discounted debt, and then they turn around to the debtor country and they make an exchange. They say, we'll go ahead and retire or dramatically reduce this debt for you if you agree to do some, maybe enact a policy, set aside area, but also fund it, but importantly, fund it with your local currency. And so that was the beginning of debt for nature swaps. And there were initially throughout Latin America and eventually in elsewhere in the world, even in Poland, there was a very large debt for nature swap. These were mostly focused on tropical forests, but also began to focus on other ecosystems. And so they took off. These are third-party transactions. But by early 1990s, governments that also had these bilateral loans to countries, many in debt distress, realized that this was a great mechanism. So now we're what we call the second generation. What I just described was what I call the first generation debt for nature swaps. Now we're on to generation two, and these are the bilateral or multilateral, primarily bilateral transaction. And that is pretty straightforward, where a government such as the US works with a debtor country that they have a bilateral loan to. And these are countries that are having problems paying back their loans. So the US is worried that they may never get their money back. But also these countries have to have certain, typically governments require that the debtor nations have stable political systems, have a certain level of resources like high value, unique tropical forests or later coral reefs, etc., and owe the government of whatever government it is money. So they take that loan and they restructure it, or potentially even erase it, but often it's restructured so that the debtor nation may have a longer time to pay it back with better terms, and perhaps the premium, the principal, is also reduced. But In exchange, the debtor nations typically set up conservation trust funds where they put much of the money saved into a trust fund, and then they set up a board, which includes the debtor and the government officials, nominees from each of those on the board, but also local individuals from local NGOs, from academic institutions and research institutions. And this board will then give out the funds on an annual basis because money comes in every year from the savings from the loan. And then it is distributed for projects in the country that relate back to whatever they've set it up for. And some of the money also goes to fund the agencies. So this really took off even more than the first generation. Ultimately, there were more than 200 of these bilateral second generation swaps. And by the early 2000, there was a modification called a subsidized bilateral transaction or swap. And that is pretty much the same arrangement. However, a third party, typically a conservation organization, would come in and help subsidize it, essentially provide money to help provide additional money to the creditor government in order to help make uh, the transaction work. And what they get out of this is a seat at the table. They often will have one of their members on the Conservation Trust Fund. They'll help in the negotiations and determining what are the larger commitments required in these debt for nature swaps. So around 2000, we started to see some of these subsidized swaps. So these first and primarily second generation swaps continue to this day. However, the great number of them happened in the late 80s and early 90s. And now you see that by the 2010s, they really became few and far between. And it's only recently that we've started to hear about them again. Though these second generation swaps are still going on, there was one last year between the US government and Indonesia, which was quite large. So they haven't disappeared. But ultimately, these first and especially second generations never quite had the full promise that folks had in the beginning that these were going to continue to scale to address both the debt and conservation issues. And so the question is, well, why didn't they scale? And there were some some contextual aspects which contained them. One of them was the debt crisis of the 80s was largely resolved, and there were other instruments, legal instruments, international programs that did a better job addressing a country's debt or reduced much more of the debt, such as the uh, highly indebted poor countries initiative, HIPCA, and HIPC, and various other regulatory changes that made them a little less attractive. Also, interestingly, for the second generation debt, these really focused on bilateral government to government, and governments throughout Europe and Canada were doing these, but the US really was in the lead, and Japan also has been involved in debt for nature swaps. But most of the loans from the US government that would have been susceptible to such deals have largely been addressed. The US has reduced this type of lending. It's moved much more towards multilaterals, and generally there are very few remaining opportunities, at least in the US government, to do this sort of debt swap, debt for nature swap. In addition, there has been a huge increase in indebtedness, but it isn't through bilateral loans to what's called the Paris Club, which are largely US and European and other sort of Western lenders. But instead, most of that increase has been to China through bilateral lending, and China, up to this point, has not shown an interest or very little interest in engaging in debt for nature swaps, or to, importantly, to the private sector, to Eurobonds. And Eurobonds doesn't mean it's just to the EU. That just means they are essentially to private sector. There are many more private sector, foreign or external loans to these countries than there used to be. So at some level, the opportunity has decreased. But importantly, there were also some serious constraints or shortcomings in these first two rounds, first two generations of debt for nature swaps, which also made them less attractive as we move forward. And we can think of these from the debtor's perspective. Probably the most important was that these debt for nature swaps really reduced a trivial amount of the debt, so little that it had very little income on debt distress, and yet the transaction costs, the negotiations were extremely complex and cumbersome. And so the ministries of finance just really didn't get excited about this. It was a lot of effort for what they saw little advantage from the debt perspective. The second was that one of the reasons to do this is to help these countries with their debt, but there was a concern, and actually this concern continues to this day, that if they begin to negotiate such a program, it will be seen by the three credit rating agencies. There are three credit rating agencies in the world that essentially do all the sovereign debt ratings, and that ends up having an effect on how a country can borrow money, at what level and from whom, et cetera, what their costs will be. And there was a fear that just negotiating or being involved in these debt for nature swaps would signal to these agencies not that they're trying to address their problem, but in fact that they are in a vulnerable debt situation and on the risk of defaulting, and that this could actually decrease their credit rating, which is a big problem and really deters a lot of countries from being involved. And then finally, on a different angle is sovereignty infringement. And from the very first debt for nature swap in Bolivia, there has been a pushback from the populace of the countries, both at the level of the government, who feel like there's an imbalance in these negotiations where the creditors come in not just being owed money, but having much more information and powerful negotiators versus often very small, poor countries that feel at a disadvantage. But also at the level of the communities in the areas that are affected by these debt swaps, where they often feel like they are selling away their natural resources. So in Bolivia, there were protests on the street, and this has happened in Thailand in 2003. The US was about to do one of these bilateral swaps and essentially had to be canceled because there was fear that within the populace of Thailand that the US was coming to take over Thai forests. Now, from the more from the creditor side, and especially those interested in the conservation impact, it was a little more positive. Clearly, projects found funding and there was activity over hundreds of different projects, and so that was positive. But there was still quite a bit of question of how significant these projects really were. One is they tended to be fairly focused at a small scale, which uh, limits, obviously, the conservation impact, but also leads to problems with leakage. And by the way, all these issues that I mentioned have been mentioned specifically for debt for nature swaps, but also during the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. These are similar concerns that have been raised with a lot of conservation and development projects that many of which are not related, but they face similar problems. The second is the fungibility of funding. That is the worry that the government is going to put money towards what they commit to, but then take other money away. So, for example, there are cases where there has been the Environmental Protection Agency of a country has been funded, but it was pretty clear that it was defunded in another line. There's also, particularly in the early debt for nature swaps, just a sense that we've signed the deal and now we can, say, great job, we've done it, with little tracking and accountability, no performance-based relief. So the debt relief wasn't actually dependent on doing the things they said. It was essentially just relieved with the sense that it would happen. And then when there was performance actually measured, which started to come in with later negotiations and later projects, it tended to focus very much on the process, not the outcome. For example, if the park that they're talking about has been approved by the parliament, then therefore it's done, rather than actually looking at an outcome. Is this park being protected? Are the laws being enforced? New policies being enforced, etc. So these were nagging problems that actually led to sort of the diminution of some of these debt for nature swaps. Now, the in after COVID, we have had a huge amount of government spending across the globe, which has led to yet another historic period of debt distress and potential debt default across the world, especially in many of the poorest countries and especially many small countries. And so we're back in another period of a debt crisis due to post-COVID. Also, these high inflation rates really are very hard on these countries that are having to pay back in foreign currency, and the Ukraine war and all of the trade issues. All of these are really putting huge stress. So once again, debt for nature swaps have come back as a potential solution, because I think most people on this call also realize that we have not yet resolved our both biodiversity and climate crises. So these three crises come back together, but now we're on to the third generation of swaps. And this was really launched by the Nature Conservancy. And the first one, this is unlike the second generation, which were government to government. These are coming back to private sector led swaps, focusing not on government loans, but primarily on private loans. And it's really more of a debt buyback. It's really converting a debt buyback and then refinancing with better terms. So it's a bit complicated, way more complicated than the earlier one. So I'm going to walk you through this, and then we're going to go and get an example in the next section from Belize. So the key partners are typically an environmental organization, and they can begin years ahead of time talking with both the creditors, which tend to be banks or others issuing bonds, bondholders, and then also the debtor governments. within the debtor governments, they set up something called a special purpose vehicle, which is a financial uh, institution that can essentially broker the deal, but is closely linked to the key partner. And with a bank, the bank is going to put out a blue bond. It's not, you may have heard of a green bond or a blue bond. This is similar, and we're calling it blue bonds because the first bunch of these all focus on marine conservation. But it's essentially a bond that's going to help um, allow this transaction. And it is very attractive to those who are interested in investing in green or environmental activities while getting a good return, a good and dependable return. So they're bringing in new investors, and the amount they're looking for is to help them because the bank is going to lend this money to the SPV, who in turn is going to lend it to the debtor government. And there are public institutions, could also be private, but typically public, like the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, or the Inter-American Development Bank, that will provide what's called a credit enhancement. It's essentially insurance that if that debtor government ends up reneging for whatever reason, but defaulting, they've got say, the strength of the U.S. government behind it, or the Inter-American Development Bank. And what that allows is to get a better rate. So while that debtor country may have very dubious uh, credit rating, sovereign credit rating to the world, knowing that it's backed or largely backed allows them to get a higher rated bond over here, the blue bond, but then also a better rate going forward. So the debtor nation then works with the bondholders to buy back their bonds at this discounted rate for whatever the secondary market price is, or the face value. And then they now owe the SPV the money to pay them back, and the SPV owes the bank, and the bank pays off their bond. And the difference, and now there are two differences that they've saved money. One is because the debtor nation has bought back these bonds at a lower rate due to the discount, and they're also paying, their servicing is with better terms because of the credit enhancement from the de-riskers. So with this extra money, both the SPV and the debtor nation are putting money into both an endowment and also a fund that will fund the conservation. So it's much more complicated, but the Nature Conservancy started this, and several other organizations, Pew Charitable Trust, the Catholic Relief Service, and others have begun to follow the model. These are the 9 third-generation swaps that have taken place so far. The first 6 are marine conservation, but you can also see that they've moved to forest conservation, climate adaptation and wastewater treatment, and also river restoration and water security. So a couple other key points. The Seychelles was transitional. It wasn't a full third generation. It actually was subsidized by a philanthropy, which is why the debt service reduction is lower than the conservation fund. But after that, they all pretty much followed the same model. Importantly, there's a couple things that you should note here. First of all, the Belize and Ecuador had the largest or the lowest secondary market discount, roughly in the order of, say, 50 cents on the dollar, or more or less 40 cents for Ecuador, 55 for Belize. which still allowed a really large difference. And some of the others, like Gabon, where the secondary market price is really very similar to the face value, the full value, you find that the amount that you get is much less. But the second thing is that all of these from Belize on had this credit enhancement, which still allowed this differential and allowed money to be diverted. So just sort of looking back, comparing first, second, and third generation, and these numbers are all approximate because there's no one formal list in the world of all debt for nature swaps. But the first generation had a little more than 50, about $200 million was restructured, which generated 67 million for conservation, which is nice, but over many years, it's a modest amount. Generation two really upped that. There have been more than 200, most in the US. The US has been in the lead in this. I have only the US authorized the bilateral through a whole series of legislation, the two big ones being the Enterprise for the Americas initiative and then later the Tropical Forest Conservation Act. I only have the first one because don't yet have comparable numbers for the Tropical Forest Conservation Act, but a couple of key things to note. Surely it's a large jump up from generation one, but still, given how many there are, it's really remarkable how much lower it is than the third generation, these bilaterals. And also, the debt restructured was a lot larger than the amount of money ultimately moved towards conservation because often these governments, through these deals, were really also trying to help these countries get back on their feet. Whereas when you move to generation three, you see that a much larger percent of the money saved actually does go directly towards conservation. And it's really scaled quite a bit. So that's the background. I now want to move towards asking a couple of questions. The first one is, so have these G3 third generation swaps address these earlier concerns that I mentioned from the first two? And I'm going to give just some broad answers to that, and then we're going to look specifically at some case studies from Belize to put a little more depth. I have a team at Duke of faculty and students who are working on this project. We're going to know a lot more in about 6-9 months about this. So this is a work in progress, and some of what I tell you is we're still collecting information on this. But so financial scale, clearly, so I'm just going to quickly walk through at a high level. For the financial scale, clearly this is at a much higher scale than earlier. And that has the effect of bringing, I think, more ministries, attracting more ministries of finance, because now we're beginning to look at sums that could move the scale. That said, the Belize project that we're about to look at is the largest proportionally of any of these third generation swaps. And even this one measure of the debt distress is the service or the relief to GDP. And in the case of Belize, this last third generation swap still only affected 12% of the debt. So even at best, it's still only beginning to chip away, and many of the other ones were still too small to have an impact. Meanwhile, the transaction costs have ballooned. While they were complicated in the first two, now they're opaque and they have to happen behind closed doors because so much of the impact depends on the investors of the world not knowing that this negotiation is about to happen, so that that difference in the secondary market price and face value remains large. So they become very opaque and lengthy, and which opens up a lot of concern, sovereignty concern, and not sovereignty concern, just concern for who's making all the money. Creditworthiness, part of what this is about is to help a country improve their creditworthiness. To date, only Belize has actually seen their national credit rating improve, and that's by one of the three credit rating agencies. In the case of the first debt swap in Ecuador, third generation, for the Galapagos, the credit rating agencies gave different accounts. Some thought it indicated that the country is on the risk of default, debt distress, and so they warned that this was a negative, whereas others thought it was a positive, and the third didn't even comment on it. So there's no consistency yet on how these credit rating agencies are addressing these, which is problematic. The country of Colombia has announced that they're not interested in debt for nature swaps, largely because they don't want to risk their credit rating. The conservation impact is clearly larger. It is now at a national scale in many of these countries. A lot of them are following the Kunming, Montreal 30% goals, where they're really looking at a national scale, which really helps with the leveraging. It also, they are beginning to look at many more benefits, and instead of being very singular for, say, one protected area, they're beginning to bring in climate adaptation, climate mitigation, more social and community aspects into these grants. And they're also beginning to add some performance metrics into the actual negotiation, although they're still very much focused on just process, like has the area been declared, rather than do they have impact. And the punishment clauses are still pretty weak and not actually used. So they're improving, but there's still far to go. And then the sovereignty, we're still looking into this, but it is continues to be a big concern, and in some cases an even greater concern, because they're so complicated that there's a lot of opacity amongst the communities in particular that are affected. So in the Galapagos in Ecuador, there were riots and protests on the streets when this first came out, because there was a sense that the nature and natural resources of the Galapagos were being sold to foreign entities. So let's dive in a little deeper for just a couple of minutes to look at two examples from Belize, one from the second generation swap and one from the third. And these happened in 2001 and 2021, both by the Nature Conservancy. You may recall that this first one, which was for the Maya Marine Corridor, Mountain Corridor, setting aside 23,000 acres of forest, and then it was a little over $9 million in debt service reduction, most of which went to conservation of this 23,000 acres of forest. And the remainder was actually debt relief for Belize. The Nature Conservancy subsidized this with about, I think it was $1.3 million, and the rest came from the US government through the Tropical Forest Conservation Act. Meanwhile, in 2021, probably still the sort of high water mark for these debt for nature swaps was also done by the Nature Conservancy. This was through one of these complicated arrangements where they're buying back, in this case, one super bond that had been, all the private debt had been put together in an earlier restructuring. And through this, they were able to reduce the servicing payment of Belize by 200 million, and 180 million went towards conservation. And that was to a variety of things, which you'll see in a moment. But the biggest was to increase the marine protected area to reach the 30%, which was an additional 14% of the country's marine territory. So this is what that first one looks like. It's pretty straightforward. The US government restructures Belize's debt. The Nature Conservancy helps. This is about half of what Belize owed to the US government. And then through this endowment, 4 different local conservation organizations were in charge of essentially managing this 23,000 acre reserve. So now this more recent swap was, again, more complicated. I'm not going to go through all the pieces, but to say that everything that I described earlier ended up going towards providing something in the order of $180 million over 20 years, plus a $71 million, including a $71 million endowment that goes towards the Belize Fund for a Sustainable Future, which has members from the Nature Conservancy, from the Belize government, from local groups in Belize, from those who are affected by this marine program, and then also an endowment fund that builds over time. So when the loan is done in 20 years, money will continue to go towards providing these grants. This is overall the sort of financial provisions. The debt went from over a $500 million down to 364 million, which resulted in 20 million, or is resulting in approximately 20 million. That new blue bond went from almost junk bond status up to AA2 status because it had the backing of the US government. The sovereign credit rating of the whole country actually increased through Standard & Poor's, and all the payments are made in local currencies. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, there's 180 million that is being provided to protect the marine areas in Belize. These are the legally binding commitments. The first 2 are probably the most important, as I mentioned, increasing the area, and then having undergoing a marine spatial plan, which is in the works right now, which is a participatory process, bringing in the fishers, local communities, scientists, and others, along with the government. The Nature Conservancy is helping run this to develop a whole plan for managing these areas. There are also some non-legally binding commitments, and these include trying to link these programs with some of the other long-term goals. Now, when I say legally binding, as I said, the punishment is not actually likely to be implemented, but there is some force behind these. Most of the enforcement is at the is for processes like the declaration by the Belizean Parliament of these areas, rather than the actual outcome of healthy ecosystems, corals, mangroves, etc. As far as the MPAs so far, they have been tracking them. There's an annual report. The most recent published was from 2023, and they do report a fair amount of success. And they are in the middle of this marine spatial planning process, which is bringing in hopefully more than 100 different community members to participate in this process. And then they've already started giving out the local grants. So of this 180 million, approximately 40% will go out to these grants to local groups. 40% will go to government agencies like the Coast Guard and to help with the protection. And then the final 20% is to just administrative overhead for the organizations running this. So what are our takeaways on this? I'm going to wrap this up quickly and then some large-scale takeaways. Belize has reduced a lot, but as I said earlier, it was still only 12% as related to the GDP, and that was the largest of any third generation swap. The transaction costs have been extremely high and complex. One source thought they were as high as $80 million, which is enormous. The sovereign credit rating was increased by one credit rating agencies, but the other two did not. And importantly, the US government political risk insurance, the credit enhancement, was critical to making this work. As far as conservation impact, uh, this seems to be linked very much to the national interests and a lot of the previous and current commitments. They are beginning to put some performance accountability a little bit into the actual negotiation, but this marine spatial plan is where they're focusing on adding in indicators, some of which are outcome focused, and beginning to actually have much more accountability being set out in these marine spatial plans. And this picture is actually from the Galapagos. One of my students, Elizabeth Kroger, has done an estimation of these are large fishing vessels over the year. And this area, you have this sort of trapezoid is where the new protected area is going to be between the Galapagos and Cocos Island. This is right before the swap and right after. So this sort of monitoring is the critical kind of monitoring that we're beginning to try and look at. And then the sovereignty impact, we only have early indications of this. This is a lot of our research is going to try and focus on equity and rights and sovereignty. But a couple of key takeaways are this marine spatial process seems to be critical to bringing in community participation, and it seems to be a key source for trying to improve the information. And a lot of why this seems to be so positive is that the Nature Conservancy has been in Belize for many years and is going to continue has a longstanding relationship so that to a large degree, the goals are fairly well aligned. So lessons for scaling, not just these swaps, but similar biodiversity and climate financing. There's a fairly small number of economies that are open to this, those that are small with large foreign loans that are distressed, and these are the prime targets. This can't be replicated everywhere. Credit enhancements are critical, and they tend to be a pretty cost-effective way of public funds, much more probably than the second generation, where the government is essentially putting in all the money. This is a very cost-effective public involvement. The sovereign credit rating system absolutely needs consistency and reform. Then moving more towards the conservation, the aligned interests between the debtors, nations, and conservation NGOs improves all of the conservation impact measurements and impact. Having these aligned so that they're both have the same long-term goals. The sovereignty concerns also are lessened when there's a long-term relationship between the debtor and the NGOs. And then the inclusive development of management plans can really help with the local participation concerns. So I know that was a lot, but I'm eager to answer any questions and happy to answer them afterwards if I don't get to all of them now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, that was a lot, but really informative and a great introduction to where the swaps have been and where they're heading. We do have quite a few questions that have come in. I also have some questions collected from the registration page. But one that popped up that I think people would be really interested in hearing about is, would this type of transaction be doable for more local governments, for example, at the county or state level? So for example, this person who submitted the question asked, would it be possible to pay farmers for climate-oriented practices through a similar mechanism? And if so, is this happening? And do you know of it happening at a smaller scale than the national scale?
It can't exactly happen. And in fact, but there are elements of this that could translate. And I'm going to slightly change that question to say that one of the problems right now with the sovereign debt for nature swaps is that some of the poorest countries that have incredibly rich, say, biodiversity or very important climate adaptation needs and huge debt, a lot of their debt is domestic and not foreign. And this doesn't even work in those cases. And so we need to figure out how to help those countries that have debt to domestic sources. And that could be at a local scale or at a national, but still domestic scale. So there are lots of pieces of that would work, but this exact process, not so much. And yeah, but the credit enhancement is a critical piece that could translate.
Okay, well, a small piece is still useful. So we had a couple questions about how the current US administration might affect the viability of existing and future swaps, given the de-risking role that the US government has played in these in the past.
So nobody knows, and that's a big question. The first thing to say is it's not just the US government. The Inter-American Development Bank has been very active in this space, and they're, of course, not, the US is a big stakeholder there, but they're not. And the second thing is that some of the recent third generation swaps have actually had elements of philanthropic or NGO credit enhancement also contributing. So it doesn't have to be public credit enhancements. It could come from elsewhere. But that said, the DFC, the main agency, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which is the entity in the US government that's done that, seems to be the one agency involved in foreign assistance and loans that is actually going to see a big jump in their budget. Where they put that is not known. So, call your senator, tell them to make sure that DFC continues to do credit enhancements. So we don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
add
sure
it,
some people might know, but I don't know.
add it to the list about what to call your senator about.
Yeah.
So what we just switching gears a little bit, talking about the national governments of these debtor nations, could you talk about a bit further about how much they're actually involved in planning for how the funds from these newer swaps will actually be used and what they're used for?
And by national government, do you mean, is that instead of the local communities or instead of the creditor like the NGOs?
I don't have details from
Okay.
the question, but I'm gonna guess it's to what level are the governments as opposed to the creditors or the
Yeah.
NGOs? Yeah.
So, so there, at least in this third generation, it's sort of a two-step process. As I said, one is the negotiating the actual deal, which happens behind the scenes. And there are groups like the Nature Conservancy that have a playbook, and they come in and they have their priorities, but they work with the government, and it's a real back and forth. And they have a lot of financial expertise, but it is definitely a conversation. And one place like in Belize, where the Nature Conservancy has a local chapter for a long time, that's very embedded, I think there's a lot of interplay. But they are bringing something to the government. There are other folks out there doing other things, saying, hey, we've got some way to help you with your debt, and it might have to do with agriculture, or it might be some new fangled financial something. So they're also looking for what's the best financial deal. But if they're going to do a debt for nature swap, they have to deal with whomever that partner is. So it is a back and forth where the local communities and national agencies get involved is once the debt happens and they come up with these marine spatial plans, which is really where the rubber hits the road. And then it becomes a much more engaged process at the national, but especially at the community level. At the communities are not involved in that initial deal. Hopefully, it fits with the national priorities of the country that are already set up. Um, and most of these do.
And I'm gonna try to squeeze in one more question, although we have 1 minute left, so this will have
Okay,
to be a quick answer. But from a
yes,
conservation investor perspective, why should someone put money into a debt for nature swap rather than just invest in conservation grants or programs?
good question. I think you can get potentially more bang for the buck. It's a way of leveraging more funds and also helping a country, um, at least a little bit, their debt distress.
Great. Thank you for your brevity. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Liz, for taking the time to share your presentation. As a reminder, this was recorded, and I'll be sending the recording around to everyone who registered. And so please look out for that in the next week. But thank you again, everyone, for being online today, and we hope you join our webinars in the future. Take care.
Thank you.